webinar on lessons from an evaluation of the global environmental facilities, interventions in conflict and fragile situations. This is being held as part of the Global Evaluation Initiative's gLOCAL Evaluation Week. This evaluation was conducted by the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environmental Facility, which reports directly to the GEF Council. I am Geeta Batra, the Chief Evaluator and Deputy Director of the GEF IEO. I have 25 years of experience in international development, mainly in the World Bank Group, and 15 years and counting in evaluation. I will be the moderator for this session. I will now introduce our panelists. Dr. Tracy Hart is the Global Lead for Fragile and Conflict States for the Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy Global Practice at the World Bank. Tracy leads a community of practice to share knowledge across subject matter specialists, both inside and outside the World Bank. Dr. Hart's career has spanned 30 years, 75 countries, with substantial experience in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Most of Tracy's work has been at the nexus of water and environment, including work in treated wastewater reuse, natural and artificial wetlands, water quality management, drylands management, among several other areas. Carl Brooke is an international environmental lawyer with more than 20 years of experience, a recognized authority on environmental governance and environmental peace building. He has helped several countries across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, and Eastern Europe, in particularly strengthening their laws, institutions, and practices. Since 2007, Carl has been a leader in a global effort to establish a new multidisciplinary field of environmental peace building, and established and leads the environmental peace building knowledge platform, the Peace Building Academy. Carl led the team from the Environmental Law Institute, which conducted this evaluation with the GEF IEO. Anupam Anand is an evaluator with the GEF IEO and has led evaluations on biodiversity, sustainable forest management, land degradation, fragility and conflict, and illegal wildlife trade. Prior to joining the GEF, he was a remote sensing scientist at the Global Land Cover Facility, working on multiple NASA-funded projects. Anupam holds a PhD in ecological applications of LiDAR remote sensing from the University of Maryland and a postgraduate diploma in environmental law. As you can see, we've got a very illustrious panel here. In terms of housekeeping, we will give Tracy, Carl, and Anupam about 12 minutes each to complete their presentations. We will take questions after that. You can either use the chat window to post your questions or ask a question during the Q&A session. Please use the raise the hand function to be called upon. As always, please remember to mute when you're not speaking. And this session is being recorded to provide access to those who could not join us, given the number of events being held simultaneously this week. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tracy, our first presenter. Tracy, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me and inviting me. I am happy to be here, getting my screen up and ready. Okay, sorry. Okay, here we go. So I'm speaking, I'm basically setting up the stage for our discussion that we'll get into monitoring and evaluation. But what I want to talk about generally is how we approach environment, fragility, and conflict in the World Bank. And so what I want to note is that the bank is actually, or part of it is called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And it was founded in Bretton Woods in 1945, specifically to work on the reconstruction of post-World War II Europe. And so included in this reconstruction was a lot of infrastructure and a lot of cleanup that had an impact on the environment. So even in our start, we were really working in post-conflict environments. So this is a bit of the evolution of how we've looked at our work with fragile and conflict states. As I noted, we started with post-conflict reconstruction. We've kind of shifted to defining fragile and conflict states and setting out a based approach with the 2011 World Development Report. We have pivoted a bit to looking at prevention and also our role in active conflict. And really natural resource management than we once were. And then we started to get into very specific investment strategies for how we use our IDA or International Development Association funds to be able to address poverty within fragile and conflict states. So what I'd like to do is share with you that the share of poor living in fragile and conflict states is currently about 50% of the total share of global poor, and that it's expected to go up to 2/3 of the total poor in the next 10 years. That's figure one. Likewise, you can tell that poverty rates in fragile and conflict states are really on the whole 20% or more. And if a country is able to escape fragility and conflict, its chronic poverty rate can actually decline to 5% less. Fragile and conflict state category and see that chronic poverty rates in those countries that are chronically in fragility or conflict is 40% or so. If a country has escaped fragility, they usually, as a subsequent trend, cut their poverty rate in half. And countries that have never been in a state of fragility and conflict have poverty rates of less than 5%. Another way to view this is that all sorts of human capital indicators are lagging behind in fragile and conflict state economies. So people in fragile and conflict states are 2 times as likely to be undernourished, 3 times as likely to be unable to send their children to school, 2 times as likely to see their children die before the age of 5, and 2 times likely to lack clean water. And these are basic human capital indicators. So I realized that one thing I haven't done is really define fragility and conflict. And I don't have a slide on it, but let me just tell you that fragility is defined on the basis of of what's called a CPIA, which is a country policy and institutional assessment indicator. And it looks at the country's policies and regulations and its ability to monitor and enforce those policies and regulations. And with respect to conflict, the conflict definition for countries is based on data from ACLED, which looks at the number of conflict-related deaths per capita in countries across the world. So you can be a country that's in fragility and not conflict. You can be a country that's in conflict but not fragile necessarily. And you can be a country that's in both fragility and conflict, just to be clear. So what are the 4 pillars of engagement we have in terms of engaging in fragile and conflict states? One is to prevent violence and prevent conflict in terms of investing in institutions, and especially local institutions that are able to address and resolve conflict, especially related to perhaps assets and natural resource assets so as to be able to isolate and contain low levels of conflict or violence. Secondly, we are trying to remain engaged during conflicts more than we have previously. And one thing that this involves is a lot of cooperation with humanitarian institutions such as the Red Cross, such as Doctors Without Borders, UNICEF, in terms of trying to continue to deliver critical services like education and health during active conflict so that we can reduce the rates of non-conflict related deaths during these times. Then we're trying to help countries out of fragility by being able to address and support their renewal of governance functions and trying to restart economies. And then lastly, we're trying to address forced displacement as well as non-conflict related shocks that result in large-scale migration patterns. So what does this mean for how we interact with the environment and natural resource management sector? And I've just given you some examples. So with respect to trying to prevent conflict, trying to invest in sustainable land management and sustainable forest management, and specifically the institutions, the local institutions which work to share and govern the use of these resources, as well as being able to sustain livelihoods so that people are living a bit more above the critical poverty line with respect to their own local incomes. In terms of remaining engaged during conflicts, what we have done is we have usually tried to work during conflict at with governments and other non-state actors, let's say, to look at if natural resource management or natural resource assets are financing conflict. For example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia uses charcoal and the movement of charcoal as a major source of its funding. As you know, there's been use of diamonds, use of oil in Iraq and Syria by ISIS in order to finance their conflicts. And so a lot of this work we've done is very much behind the scenes in terms of trying to manage the demand for these conflict associated resources and trying to perhaps disrupt the trade flow of these natural resource assets. In terms of helping countries out of fragility, we work on peace building efforts, environmental cleanup, and we try to look at how to manage the increased demand for natural resource assets during Reconstruction. And then, of course, when there are refugees in host communities, there are increased pressures on firewood, water supply, et cetera, and we try to manage those. So just to give you a short view, 70% of our current interventions are in the kind of pre-conflict phase of looking at fragile and conflict interventions. About 10% of our funding are in active conflict countries where we're actually working to improve environmental services and conditions both within refugee communities and in nearby host communities. And then about 20% of our interventions are in post-conflict countries. And here's an example of trying to kind of restart cocoa farming in Colombia. So why is working in FCD countries difficult with respect to environment and natural resources? Basically, citizens are making shorter term decisions with respect to how they manage their natural resource assets. So for example, you might be drawing down and using your seeds from your seed bank if you need them in the short term as a food source. You might be trying to farm your land with a cash crop that is less sustainable in the long term in terms of topsoil. There's all sorts of examples. So lessons from implementation in fragile and conflict state environments. These are kind of generic lessons, really. You know, I see and I continue to see a tremendous amount of over-designed projects in terms of numbers of components and activities. I tend to, you know, I see, and I've seen successfully, let's say, capacity built by applied capacity building, i.e. capacity building in service of the development or the investments of the project rather than as a separate add-on. Lastly, I just want to share with you, there is a draft document called 12 M&E Recommendations to Improve Results in Fragile and Conflict States. This is coming out from the World Bank. It should be published in the next 3 or 4 months. And it gives information of basically applying what we know about fragile and conflict states to project design, and how to basically integrate the focus of fragility in PDOs, integrating what we know about what works about working in fragile and conflict states into M&E plans and systems. And you can see here that they call for increased use of beneficiaries and local CSOs in order to engage in the monitoring process and to also have communication functions that tie in so that the data collection and use of data is also more transparent in terms of sharing the data and the results of that data with communities in real time. And then adapting and learning and evaluating with a lens of what happens in fragile and conflict states. And so one of the primary lessons I like is to monitor, learn, and adapt more frequently, and to make sure that you have indicators that will allow you to have a kind of an early warning system as to whether or not there are activities or components that aren't moving and need to be resigned earlier than a midterm review, what I call a quarter term review. So this is, in short, my window to how we work in this world. And I'm looking forward to Carl and Anupam's presentation so that we can move this dialogue further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracy, for setting the stage. For those who don't know, the GEF is a partnership and operates through 18 agencies, of which the World Bank was one of the 3 original agencies of the GEF. And so we learn a lot and continue to learn a lot from the implementation of GEF projects through the World Bank as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Carl for his insights and lessons from GEF evaluation on fragility and conflict affected situations, which was led by the Environmental Law Institute under Carl's leadership. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, and I am delighted to be here. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen. Can you see this? Okay, so as Geeta mentioned, I'll be sharing the results of an evaluation that we conducted for and with the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF. And it's focusing on programming in fragile and conflict-affected situations. There are more than 4,000 GEF projects. Several IEO evaluations over the years have provided evidence that fragility and conflict affect outcomes, but there have been no independent assessment of GEF interventions in such situations, hence this analysis. We worked at 3 levels. We looked at the global portfolio. We looked at 7 specific situations, Colombia, Mali, the Albertine Rift, the Balkans, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Cambodia. And we looked at the full portfolio within those countries, within those situations, I should say. And then we did a deep dive on about 8 to 10 projects in each of those 7 situations. So looking at the global, the situation level, and then the project level. So the first question is this at all relevant? Is this something that GEF should be thinking about? And well, the vast majority of GEF projects occur in countries that are affected by conflict and fragility. And we saw about 88% of GEF country level projects occurred in fragile environments. And you can see this on the left here, alert and warning being fragility. And then for countries affected by major armed conflict, these are conflicts that have 1,000 or more battle deaths, about a third of the projects and a third of the funding, 29% of the funding, more than $4 billion as of July 2020 were in these situations. So there's potential risk here. Is it affecting the outcomes of the projects or how the projects are being undertaken? And we saw that fragility has a statistically significant impact on all performance indicators, as we see with the terminal evaluation reports. Everything from M&E design and implementation to execution quality and outcomes. We also saw that both conflict and fragility had statistically significant impacts on a project being canceled or dropped, as well as increased duration of delays. So GEF projects are in many conflict and fragile situations. This has an impact on the performance of the projects. How does conflict and fragility affect GEF projects? And we identified 5 general pathways. The first is physical insecurity. It's difficult to get to the site, difficult to hire staff. Sometimes we saw projects canceled because they couldn't find appropriate staff. Social conflict and mistrust around land tenure, sensitivities in hiring project staff, economic drivers around the illicit trade of natural resources, as Tracy was mentioning, gave a couple of good examples. Competition over resources that can drive conflicts and put staff at risk. Political fragility and weak governance, difficulty managing the project, difficulty focusing on implementation, corruption, and rule of law, and then the coping strategies, which again, Tracy did a great job of highlighting how people in tenuous situations, whether it's fragility or conflict, often have shorter timelines and they may liquidate their assets in different situations. So these are all sorts of risks. These are problems. The interesting thing here is that these contexts also provide opportunities. That where there is social conflict and mistrust, we see projects being designed to increase cooperation among groups. We see this especially with international waters projects. With economic drivers, we see efforts that have a pronounced element focusing on livelihoods and sustainable natural resource management, in addition to the conservation. And with political fragility and weak governance, we see projects being designed to align with governmental priorities and with peace-building priorities in certain instances, in part to make it more relevant and to both socially and politically. So I think it's important to understand these different ways that conflict and fragility affect projects. And I will also note these often occur in synergy. It's not just one pathway for one situation. You'll often have multiple pathways. So given this situation, it was notable that the GEF has, as such, no specific safeguards, policies, guidance, or procedures to manage conflict and fragility-related risks to projects. At the same time, half of the GEF agencies already have developed policies, strategies, and toolkits. And so what we're seeing is that staff are, in many cases, innovating approaches. Sometimes you see, when you have this longer view of the projects, early on you see a lot of problems, and then you see staff starting to say, okay, we don't want to repeat that. So they start doing things independently because there are no standard policies or guidance, and innovating. And we found that there are 5 general ways that staff and projects have tried to account for conflict and fragility. The first is acknowledgement. And we see a number of projects where they say, yes, there's a conflict. That's it. They don't try to manage the risks. They don't propose anything. They acknowledge it's there. But there's no risk management. It's a start, but it's to really be effective, it's insufficient. So we then see 4 other strategies. The first is avoidance. There's conflict over here, so we're going to work over here. And you avoid the problems associated with the conflict. The problem is sometimes, and often actually, conflicts are in biodiversity hotspots. So if you really want to achieve the global environmental benefits that the GEF is trying to accomplish, how do you reconcile those tensions? The second is mitigation. The project engages in the context, but seeks to mitigate the risks through training, through early warning, through participatory approaches, through adaptive management. The third is going beyond trying to mitigate the risks and actually embracing the peace-building opportunities. This helps to generate political will. I mentioned the focus on livelihoods, co-benefits, and environmental restoration. And finally, we see projects learning from their experiences. And sometimes this happens during the life of the project. Often it's at the terminal evaluation stage, and the projects are sometimes learning from what happened in their projects. Sometimes they're learning from others. So conflict and fragility matter. Yes, there are risks, but there are also opportunities. These risks need to be managed. And they need to be approached differently than in non-conflict affected settings, in non-fragile settings. Hence, conflict sensitivity. And these have gone from at this point I'm shifting from findings to recommendations, but all of these are basically key findings. So conflict and fragility matter. There are risks and opportunities. The risks need to be managed through conflict sensitivity. And the ways that most projects, and I would also say other institutions, do conflict sensitivity is early assessment of the risks and planning for potential complications, and then ensuring that there are tools necessary to support conflict sensitive programming. And we highlighted 5 opportunities for the GEF in the evaluation by which the GEF can better integrate conflict sensitivity into the project. I'm going to leave these here for you to read, but basically these are options. I think of them as longer term options. Some can be done quickly, but I think the key here really is the evidence that we have collected in this evaluation goes beyond everything that I have read on conflict sensitivity. Most of the conflict sensitive language is based on ideology and anecdotes. And here, for the first time, there's a large body of evidence to really say, how do conflict and fragility affect projects, and how are these projects seeking to manage those risks? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carl. Just to add a little perspective, we realized that a lot of what GEF was doing, more than 50% of GEF's projects were actually in conflict and fragile situations. And that's when we embarked on this evaluation together with the Environmental Law Institute with Carl. And so it's very helpful for someone like Carl, who's been working a lot on this issue, to say that this is a very rich evidence base that one can draw on. And secondly, I would like to add that this evaluation was presented to the GEF Council. It was very well received across the 18 agencies and the GEF partnership, and all recommendations were adopted, and the GEF is actually working on addressing some of the issues pointed out in the context of this evaluation. But it wasn't easy, and we had to come up with various methods and approaches to be able to assess impact, which is what evaluators like to do. What are the outcomes and impacts? And so within the course of the evaluation, we relied on a spectrum of approaches and methods. And Anupam, who is our geospatial expert within our team, applied some of his good remote sensing methods to try and answer some of the outcome and impact questions within the context of the evaluation. With that, over to you, Anupam, for your geospatial analysis presentation.
Thank you, Geeta, and I hope everyone is doing well. So we heard about the importance and various challenges in FCV situations from Tracy and Carl. Now I'm going to switch gears and discuss about methods. There's a growing opportunity in geospatial data and methods that we have leveraged to address evaluation and monitoring challenges in FCV situations. There has been unprecedented flow of spatial data from various sources, particularly the satellite data. We have about 3,400 operational satellites that are taking various measurements and at timely intervals. These are also becoming cheaper and widely available. Rapid advancement in analytical tools have made it easier to process the geospatial data, or the so-called big geo data. There are several advantages of using geospatial data for M&E in fragile and conflict situations. I'm going to highlight a few of them. The first one is the logistical challenge or challenges. They help us deal with logistical challenges, and this has safety and cost implication, particularly in FCB situation where it's not very safe and secure. They help us deal with methodological challenges, such as lack of baseline and finding the right counterfactual for impact evaluations. They also allow analysis at different scales. One can conduct analysis at a project level, or at a country level, or even at a global level. They also provide us evidence that could be reproduced and replicated, thereby aiding in objectivity and transparency. And these are increasingly being used to track, monitor, and evaluate human rights violations and corruption in FCV situations. And finally, the last one on my non-exhaustive list is that they are applicable to a variety of evaluation methods and themes. So they're just not limited to conflict or environment. There are other areas where these could be applied in tandem. And I will exemplify some of these in next few slides. So we know that real world is complex. Geospatial approach simplifies the real world. The photograph represents the real world. You can see that it consists of multiple components and there are so many processes. The geospatial model splits this complex world into layers of relevant information. These information could be from various sources, such as satellites, conflict incidents, drones, surveys, field visits, or data from e-devices. And what is common in all these data layers is that we know their location. So location binds all these data sets together. Geospatial models such as this open a lot of possibilities for obtaining evaluative evidence, as they allow pattern analysis, trend analysis, change detection, understanding the interrelationship between various factors. I will demonstrate with one specific example in reference to environmental intervention in protected areas and conflict. And this caters to the relevance question that Carl was mentioning about conflict and conservation overlapping each other. So here you are looking at the map and image from Virunga National Park, the oldest protected area in Africa, one of the last remaining habitats of mountain gorillas. The map is overlaid with conflict data and helps us see the spatial pattern of the conflict. This information is very useful as it provides the context and helps us frame evaluation questions. This can be useful for mission planning as well. Analysis like this can be scaled up. The heat map here shows us that there is a lot of conflict-related fatality in and around the GEF-supported protected areas at a regional level over a period of 30 years, of course, so not just during the project duration, but also before the project and after the project. And it's important to take the entire conflict cycle when we are thinking about a project and its outcome. As you can observe here, that the numbers are very high in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a similar trend in other areas. But as we go farther away from protected areas, there are more conflict-related fatality, and of course we understand that's because the area becomes larger. Now, in addition to providing context and baseline information, geospatial methods can help identify the drivers of environmental degradation and conflict. They also help quantify the extent of the problem and the changes therein. This is particularly useful in hard-to-reach, isolated, and unsafe areas. Here is an example from a GEF IEO evaluation in Colombia. The map shows mining areas overlap with hotspots of conflict and conservation. So during the evaluation mission, we went to one of these illegal mining sites, and within minutes, we were told to leave the site for our own safety. So I went to a safe distance and I flew a drone over the area, of course, with the permission from the authorities. Not only this provided us with visual evidence of environmental degradation, but this data also fed into a machine learning classification algorithm that helps us estimate the total area under mining and associated environmental degradation. So here you can see how the data from the drone was helpful in scaling up the estimates to the larger project area. This area is always cloudy, but thankfully there are sensors that helps us see through clouds, night, or even during inclement weather. Now that we have these kind of data and analytics, one can look at interrelationship between conflict and environment more closely. Here are the results from Guaviare Department in Colombia, home to one of the GEF flagship projects. I had already done the forest loss analysis for the region and took the results with me. I shared it during the focused group discussions with the project participants. They were not surprised with the results, showing more deforestation during the post-conflict situation. And one of the project participants, an ex-combatant, summarized it succinctly. I quote, "It's the peace that brings deforestation." As evaluators, we are always interested in impact. Here is an example from a GEF watershed project in the post-conflict Rwanda. Our analysis confirmed a dramatic increase in the lake area after the project started, precisely around 2011. So you can see, a little after the project started, you can see an increase in the lake area. However, during the initial interviews with the stakeholders in Rwanda, no one recalled or mentioned any activity that could explain the results. So we looked at the flood data, we looked at the precipitation data, nothing abnormal out there. So after digging through old promotional materials of the project, we found that one of the first project activities was to remove the sediments from Lake Karago. So from a methodological perspective, remote sensing data can be invaluable for assessing impact and also for triangulation. And when stakeholder recall is limited and there is no institutional memory. So another key question that we ask as evaluators is about sustainability. Here is a snapshot from another GEF-supported project in Sapo National Park, Liberia, where this project was implemented after a decade and a half of civil instability. The remote sensing analysis shows here how the conservation success initiated during project is sustained beyond the project duration. So here is the project duration, and you can see there's hardly any forest loss even after the project completion. Whereas when you look at the trend outside the protected area, like in this buffer or in this buffer, or even outside, like in Liberia, the rate of deforestation is very high. So this helps us answer the sustainability questions as well after the project completion. And here's the final example from early COVID phase, which has now turned the entire world into a fragile situation. Using nighttime light data from satellites that is widely used as an indicator for economic growth, we were able to assess the decrease in economic activities around protected areas in Africa, including the popular sites such as Masai Mara, Serengeti, the Hell's Gate in Kenya. And many of these protected areas have been supported by GEF and are being supported by GEF currently as well. And the economic slowdown is also corroborated by the data from the cell phone. So here you can see that there's hardly any movement around and within the protected areas. With these examples, I would like to summarize the lessons based on our experience at the GEF IEO. Partnerships are important because they help ensure we are not reinventing the wheels, and also helps reduce cost. So we have partnered with the space agencies, NASA, and universities. Again, like any other method, geospatial methods are not silver bullet. In our experience, it works best within a mixed method framework. The cost to implement geospatial solutions depend on the scope of evaluation, the scale of analysis, and the skills needed. And finally, geospatial science, like any other discipline, is ever evolving. Every day there is a new satellite, a new algorithm. Therefore, it requires keeping up with the learning. And here are some resources that we have produced at the GEF IEO that could be helpful reference for future work in this direction. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Over to you, Geeta.
Thanks, Anupam. Just observing a very interesting chat going on with a number of questions. I think one is around whether there should be separate policies and given the variability across GEF agencies. Just sitting where I do and actually looking at all the GEF policies, be it safeguards, gender, fiduciary, I really don't think we need yet another set of standards and policies for working in fragile and conflict affected situations. I think the key is, can we apply these other policies that already exist and deal with a number of standards in, for example, in safeguards. The question is whether projects actually do a good contextual analysis in working in these difficult situations. I think that's more of the question, rather than trying to design still more policies which are specific to these situations. Another area pertains to good data collection and monitoring and evaluation in these contexts. And one is, looking at all these numerous GEF projects, as well as some of the World Bank projects when I was there, are the objectives well set and realistically set in these situations? Nobody's asking for one to lower the standards or lower the objectives because it's a difficult situation, but one has to be realistic. And whether the standard metrics and the standard environmental indicators with the indicators set at levels realistic in other environments would work here. And the second is, do we actually pick the right sets of indicators? In fragile and conflict affected situations, often processes are very important. It's not just about the final environmental outcome that is realized, 15 years down the road. But there's a lot of merit to just bringing people to the table, ministries to discuss issues. Those are our first steps, but are very important steps that should also be captured through the monitoring and evaluation process. So these are just a couple of thoughts I had, but I wanted to just start with our rounds of questions and along the lines of what's coming through. Tracy, you had laid out very well and coherently and explicitly the difficulties of working in fragile and conflict situations. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on the strategies that have worked based on your experience, what Carl found in the context of GEF projects. But you.
Yes, sir. Geeta, so if I understood your question, it's what are some strategies for ensuring success based on our knowledge of how our GEF projects have performed in fragile and conflict states? And I'll just draw from an example in Sudan, where we have a natural resource management project that has had GEF funding and additional financing to be able to work as part of the Great Green Wall Initiative. The strategies for success are really to have a streamlined menu of interventions from which to draw from, so that you're not trying to do everything. That's number one. Number two, very much using piloting to be able to help demonstrate new technologies and see if there is a potential for upscaling new technologies. Having local, i.e. State level capacity built, so that if there are large scale disruptions in the capital city or in the federal government, as was the case in Khartoum, the state level functions, especially those far away from Khartoum, were able to continue to function and deliver services to citizens. We did not suffer disruption in our project, even though Sudan itself was in a high state of fragility and, let's say, conflict. So those are some of what I would suggest. Over.
Thanks, Tracy. Extremely useful and very practical suggestions there. Carl, I had a follow-up for you with respect to, since we're focusing on monitoring and evaluation here, but often project design starts with a good theory of change. And what we've seen in evaluation is projects that have actually thought through a good theory of change ultimately implement well and also generate some good results at the end. As an environmental peace building expert, what would be your suggestion for elements that actually should be included in a theory of change for interventions in these contexts?
I'll start by saying I think that some of the people we've talked with in this context about theories of change for projects in conflict-affected situations are really skeptical about the utility of this, because it takes a long time to get an understanding of the context, to think through it. And these situations are so dynamic that by the time you submit it, and by the time you hear back, it's often irrelevant. Things have shifted, things have changed. And so I think that one of the couple of things that I would say, one is I think there's a need for some dynamism in the theory of change, and whether that is how it's framed, if it's broadly about improving governance, and here's what we currently have in mind, but recognizing that things are often very fluid. But I think there's a need for having a dynamic theory of change and a way to do that within the GEF process without going back to the GEF Council. This is a problem that because you make significant changes to a project, GEF Council needs to look at it again. So I think that one is trying to figure out how to write this in a way that can account for the dynamism and the changes in the situation. Second, we see in a lot of these situations that the environmental outcomes might be harder to achieve because the underlying governance arrangements, the underlying management arrangements are very weak. And so often there's a lot more effort that needs to be put into just building up basic governance and management capacity. And so maybe thinking less about how many acres you're going to protect or how many of those things, but thinking more in terms of the trying to build the underlying governance regimes. And but then thinking, long term, this is going to be an input to the next project, which will do these other things. So, and then the third thing I would say is what you were talking about earlier, Geeta, which is try to set very modest expectations about what you can accomplish. And if you go beyond that, wonderful. But trying to overpromise in these situations, I think, is often a challenge, because as Tracy said, even though not everything happens, there's still a lot of good. And so instead of meeting your mark with modest expectations, you are underperforming and getting dinged for it. So I think that having modest expectations and trying to promise less and deliver more is an important strategy for how you frame it. But I think that the question of how to manage the dynamism in these situations, this is a real challenge given the process that the GEF has right
now. Thanks, Carl. And I think with this dynamism, and I think Tracy also alluded to it in her in the chat, comes the element of risk. But we'll come back to that. I'm going to pose a question to Anupam along the lines of what I'm seeing in the chat, which is, It's very interesting to use geospatial approaches, etc. But in these contexts, as a good source of data collection, but is that sufficient? And what would be an optimal data collection strategy such that you're capturing not only, the environmental outcomes and indicators, but also some of the broader socioeconomic indicators, which are very important in interventions in these contexts. Anupam?
Thank you, Geeta. I think that's really a great question. And as you are aware, that we have been highlighting this gap through our evaluations. The M&E system is a reflection of how projects were designed. They were designed with focus on very discrete interventions. However, recently there has been more integrated and landscape level programming that attempts to address both the development and environment. And they have been paying attention to environmental as well as socioeconomic outcomes. However, it is easier said than done. And the way out is to use the best of both the domains. The use of environmental indicators as well as the socioeconomic measures. And technology, including the use of geospatial science, could help bridge this gap by speeding up and scaling up such efforts. Geolocation-based surveys could be used in tandem with environmental indicators from satellites. Moreover, geospatial data from cell phones, from social media, from satellite data such as night lights, impervious surface, etc., could also be used as a proxy for socioeconomic change. As Carl mentioned, that the situation in these areas are very dynamic. So we cannot wait for a full-blown socioeconomic survey with LSMS or other instrument to take place. We need to be agile in the way we collect data, and therefore we need to bring the best of both the worlds.
Thanks, Anupam. And I think I like the term being used here, humanizing the data here in the context of the chat. I wanted to come back to this issue of risk because associated with innovation, associated with pilots in any context, and more so in the context of these situations, carries with it a lot of risk. And one of the things going through documents, when you interview project managers, it's very clear that they have and are aware of the risk elements in implementing and designing these projects. But yet, when you go through the project documentation, you don't see a very clear articulation sometimes of these risks. Where should these risks be actually well documented? How should these risks be monitored? And at the end, what about promoting honesty in reporting and knowledge sharing of the risks that are actually realized in such situations, so that there's effective learning going on and that the incentives are not perverse to punish people if a project didn't materialize the way it was supposed to. And I think part of the onus is on evaluators also. What's a good way of getting people to understand, track these risks, and explain the context, etc., and share this with people? So over to you, Tracy, on your views on how risks should be captured, monitored, and discussed.
Damn, I was hoping you'd ask someone else this question. Sorry, this is one of these $1 million questions. I mean, it's so as I was just beginning to write in the chat, we really need a more nuanced conversation on risks. And, because we have some risks that are static in terms of fragile and complex states, we have implementation risks. we have risks associated with uncertainty. We have risks that are kind of both endogenous to the project, which we can control, and exogenous, where we need to kind of take as given. And we need to be able to, one frustration that I have currently with the bank is that the bank is okay with saying, okay, we have substantial or high risk in this project and in this country, but they want to be able to have the project right, how we can successfully mitigate these risks going into project implementation. And the truth is, sometimes we can't mitigate risks, we have to work with them. And the project risks are constantly moving. And so we really need to have a systems approach to looking at risks where we say, okay, the risks are going to change. To what extent can we design flexibility into the project to be able to respond to and reorient around risks that materialize or that wane, et cetera. I know this isn't the great answer, but it's the beginning to a discussion. I also, in the comments, I also wrote, we're even having a conversation about where these risks sit. Do they sit in the governance space? Do they sit in the social and stakeholder space, which they might if you have non-state actors that are the source of the conflict? To what extent do they sit in kind of the macro fiscal space? If an economy is kind of a conflict economy based on the source of its assets, let's say, in terms of relying on illegal drugs or et cetera, trafficking, et cetera. So even where do we place the risk discussion in the context of the project is a bit controversial. And, I think Carl said this in his presentation, but, being able to identify and be upfront about risks is the starting point, really, for being able to address risks. And so we need to have a lot more discussion and a lot more flexibility in the way that we describe risks so that we can kind of get comfortable and move on to the discussion about how we really manage risks. Over.
Thanks, Tracy. I think even raising some of the issues here and for us to reflect on, I think is very important. So thanks for that. I think there's been, some text here about, or in the chat about, geospatial approaches are not the be all and end all to measurement in these contexts. And so I wanted to ask Anupam, what do you see as some of the shortcomings and the challenges in applying geospatial approaches to measuring environmental or even other benefits, like you've mentioned with nighttime lights, et cetera, in these situations? And what would be potential improvements in this?
So thanks, Geeta. As it has been rightly pointed out, that like any data and methods, geospatial approaches have their own limitations. They can't answer all the questions, particularly the why questions. As these are based on the quintessential bird's eye view, they miss the ground perspective. The analytics could be telling us just another or just one side of the story, and therefore the geospatial scientists have to work closely with the evaluators, with the domain experts to interpret the results. So you can have all kind of analytics, but the interpretation would come from an expert. And I'll just give you a quick example from our evaluation in Uganda. So the satellite data showed deforestation within a protected area. However, when we discussed this with the local ecologist, she revealed that they just got rid of invasive Prosopis juliflora, which is an invasive species commonly found in lot many countries actually. So this was part of the restoration activity, which could have been wrongly tagged as deforestation if we just relied on the satellite imagery. And there are so many other examples. And that's why the best geospatial analysis is grounds up. It's not from the space. And I would also like to point out the other issue that I see being discussed in the chat. And this is about access, capacity, and resources when using geospatial approaches. Most of the innovation happens in the global north. Therefore, they tend to create a data and capacity divide. So we definitely need to keep this in mind when we are using these kind of technology or even prescribing it to our partners. To summarize, I would like to say that the best analysis is the one that combines the ground knowledge with geospatial analytics and involves local stakeholders.
Thanks, Anupam. I'd like to take this thought on evaluation and monitoring a little further. And Carl, since you've looked at a number of projects in this space over your long period of expertise in environmental peace building and in FCS situations, what do you see as whether these projects objectives are really realistically set? What do you think is the best way to kind of monitor results in such contexts? Do our traditional frameworks on our logic models work, or should we be focusing on something else to actually capture the challenges as well as monitoring the outcomes, because there is an accountability dimension to all the work that we do. So what would you suggest, Carl?
I think that it's very interesting to think about this because, to be perfectly frank, there are a lot of organizations that work in this space that are strapped for time and money, and monitoring and evaluation is rarely invested in. And they don't do a good job of it. It's more kind of in the head. It doesn't get onto paper. It doesn't get shared. And I will be frank, the problems are most often in the environmental community. In the development community, there's a lot more familiarity, comfort, and requirements to do monitoring, to do reporting, and to do these sorts of evaluations. So in terms of where I would be looking is probably more from the bank and from others that do this. The question of how to do it, I think one of the difficulties is scale, that often there's a lot of focus on working with and through local counterparts. And in these situations, there are social tensions, sometimes often rising to violence. And I think that in those situations, one of the really important things to do is to diversify your sources of information and monitoring, not to rely solely on that counterpart. I think that the question of monitoring goes, in this context, goes very closely with early warning. And I think that thinking, sometimes it's about monitoring, sometimes it's about what are the opportunities for people to complain, and providing, I'm thinking things that are short of an inspection panel, but just saying, hey, wait a minute, this is affecting us in these ways, and then having the opportunity to reflect and act before this escalates. But I think that the monitoring, one of the things that we're seeing also is the use of technologies, and some of it is more direct in terms of people submitting comments or feedback or what have you directly via text message and such. The other is around, depending on the context, you can look at social media posts to see if certain things are trending. And that is very specific. So I don't think that's something you generally want to rely on, but I think there's something that can be done. Another thing that I would say is, to be perfectly frank, all this takes resources, money, time, staff, and there's always this tension between how much we do in delivering services and goods and how much we are trying to plan and how much we are monitoring and evaluating. So I think that trying to be creative about how we do this, what are some of the lower cost options that can escalate, that we can then focus our resources on addressing the problems and not spend all our money just monitoring.
I completely agree with your practical view, because sometimes we as evaluators, we are expecting teams to use a very Cadillac kind of approach, do it all, not being too cognizant of the limitations on the ground, the challenges on the ground. And I think as evaluators, we need to be a little more realistic about what's actually possible in these contexts. So context situations are not just for project managers, it's also for evaluators to understand the context in which we are evaluating projects. So I think we're in the last 15 minutes of this, and it's been a very interesting chat discussion. But at this point, since we cut short on time for presentations, I would like to take the opportunity to ask each of our presenters to come up with 5, and this was not pre-programmed, so this is on the spot now, to think of the 5 main messages that you would like to give, either to practitioners or to evaluators in working in these situations. Because at the end of the day, the objective for all of us is the same: enhance environmental effectiveness, development outcomes in these situations. So what is it that you would like to tell people, from a very practical standpoint of what you would advise? Tracy, over to you first, and then Carl and Anupam.
All right. Well, in this sense, I'm glad that we've been having the chat because it allows me to kind of think through what we've been discussing. So the first is, and I cannot say this enough, really pressing for continued simplicity in project design. I mean, I just looked at a proposal for a $20 million Library of Fisheries project this morning. And the issue is everybody wants to get everything in it because it might be a single intervention, but you cannot have, 5 components and 4 subcomponents for each component and expect to deliver everything. And so having a simpler project design with some flexibility to say, okay, if this activity doesn't move forward, we've kind of got a backup plan, et cetera. And I know that's really difficult to be accountable for, but you have to first provide the correct conditions for project success. So that's number one. Number two is kind of trying to remember and state clearly the cost of inaction, because I think, if you start from the baseline of what happens if there's continued inaction with respect to this environmental asset, then you do get, you set the baseline for what an intervention can do, perhaps. A third is really this idea of being able to have nuanced conversations about risk management, where we learn how to have the conversations and are comfortable enough with our management in having these conversations that we can get beyond it for how to anticipate or plan for or as measure risk that's taking place throughout the project implementation. A fourth is, and I love being first now because I can steal everyone else's thunder, but a fourth is trying to figure out how you budget for M&E when you may not have the, when you may know that you're going to change your activities and that you may change course during the project. And so to the extent that Anupam can talk about how remote or more technical interventions can help us set baselines, these baselines usually are not dependent on local budgeting for capacity. And a lot of times our M&E function is more about building M&E capacity than it is about delivering M&E, information and outcomes. And so, we need to be able to do both. I'm going to stop with those four because I want to leave some good notes for my fellow contributors to use. Over.
Thanks, Tracy. Carl, your 4 or 5.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with one that I already said, and that is that conflict and fragility matter, and that they present risks and opportunities, which leads to the second point, that we need to be thinking and acting differently, that recognizes the dynamic context, which leads to the two sub-elements. One, think about risk management. This is not, one of the challenges as we load up the Christmas tree that is project management is, okay, now we have to think about gender and indigenous people and the environment and all these things. And those are all worthy social goals, but I have only so much money. I think one thing that's different about this is that this is really about risk management. It's not asking you to do more things, it's trying to help you do what you want to do and not implode, and not have your staff hurt. So I think that the risk management is a key framing for this, along with conflict sensitivity. The third point is that I think we need to refine our M&E practices for situations affected by fragility and conflict. I am so excited to hear about the tool that Tracy mentioned that's coming out in a couple months. That looks to be really exciting. I'm really interested in that. I will note that I am also leading a project currently supported by the U.S. Institute of Peace on monitoring and evaluation of environmental peace building. So it's a more specific context. But again, I think that there's, we are still learning how to do this well and still building the evidence base. The fourth point is we need to embrace risk and expect underperformance in certain situations and occasional failure. We need to learn from failure. And as Gita noted early on, we need to be more modest in our expectations and more targeted in these situations about what we think we can accomplish. Maybe there's a way of creating an expandable framework. Here's what we promise. Here are other things we hope will happen, but here's what we're promising. And we'll pilot test this, we'll try that. And then the final thing is, I think we need to improve our learning process. That I still see too many situations where the evaluations are done and they're put in the file. And how can we learn and change how we do programming based on the evaluations. So those are my 5 points.
Thanks, Carl. Lots of tough questions there for everybody to think about, but very helpful. Especially I'm all for learning from failure. I think we need too many of our evaluations also only point to successful interventions and not enough on what failed. And so as part of OPS 7, we are actually thinking of a section on what can we say about what we've learned from failure. Anupam, what
Sure.
efficiently?
Okay, Geeta, I think I missed your last few sentences, but I'll just go by the 5 points that you asked us to summarize our discussion with. So I would say the first one is need assessment. So, I mean, there's so much technology and there's so much knowledge out there that we get overwhelmed, and therefore I think need assessment is the first. And we should see whether a particular technology is useful or not. We shouldn't just do it because it looks fancy or looks cool. So that's one. The second one is, once you have figured out what do you need to do certain things and what's the technology case in there, the second step is collaboration, because we don't need to reinvent the wheels. We could work with institutions or experts who produce these data sets, who produce these analytical tools, and that helps us save cost, but also make sure that we are doing the right thing the right way, using the right data, making sure that we know of the assumptions, the limitations. So that's second. The third is engaging stakeholders, or engaging particularly the local stakeholders. I mean, we can use the data from the space, but the analysis should be very grounded, because that will give you buy-in, that will make sure that you are interpreting the things in the right way, and it will go a long way. Otherwise, it doesn't go a long way. You could just do boutique projects here and there and boutique integration of technology here and there, but it doesn't serve its purpose fully if we do not engage the local stakeholders. Also, I would say that be open to change. I always hear when I'm talking about technology, I always hear, oh, technology cannot do anything or everything, and we know that it cannot do everything. But even in evaluation community, I see that, oh, the questions, we should think about questions first and think about technology later. But I would challenge this idea, because, and I'm not completely challenging, I'm saying that think out of the box. And at that point in time, I would say microscope. I mean, the invention of microscope opened up a whole new field of study, genetics and microbiology. So similarly, with these technology, it has opened up a whole new world in the way we can ask new kind of questions that we were not even familiar with. If I asked the same questions 10 years back, people would laugh at me and say, hey, this is not practical. What are you saying? But now, so the idea is to be able to imbibe and endorse and embrace the technology to help ask the questions that we have never attempted to answer, to go to the places that we have never gone in our M&E, in our project design. And finally, I'll stop with the last point, because I see a lot of activity and discussion on this topic. And I think Carl also mentioned and Tracy mentioned the cost. We are not budgeted to integrate technology. We think it's very expensive. And I think there I would say that take baby steps. Do one boutique project here or one sample project here and there, and convince your managers, like I have convinced you or Yuha in going forward and trying to take more risk. and do things at larger scale. So with that, I'll stop, and that's my 5 points.
Thanks, Anupam. That brings us to the end of our session. I think it's been a very valuable session, and I think I have a couple of takeaways from this session, in addition to these very valuable 15 points that have come through from our esteemed panelists. And I think one suggestion I would have is for practitioners to actually sit with evaluators and or with results specialists. One is to think of what would be the right indicators to use in these contexts, and not stick to the standard long-term environmental outcomes and impacts or socioeconomic benefits that we traditionally measure, because these are different contexts, and we should recognize them and adjust measurement to meet these situations as well. So that's one. And the second is, I think helping practitioners think through theories of change. Because once I don't think a traditional theory of change for a particular biodiversity or climate change project, etc., it would work to some degree in these situations, but it would need to be adapted to bring in due recognition of processes that are very, very important in these contexts. The long-term outcomes in environment or socioeconomic outcomes depend a lot on the behavioral changes, et cetera, that happen through process in these contexts. And I think some of our frameworks are not adaptive enough to recognize these. So I think that's important both for evaluators to recognize as well as for practitioners. And I think with that, I'd like to just make a pitch for the GEF IEO is currently informing the 8th replenishment process of the Global Environment Facility, which is currently ongoing. The GEF replenishes the trust fund every 4 years. And in preparation for that replenishment, we produce something called the Comprehensive Evaluation of the GEF. Within that comprehensive evaluation, we have looked at fragility in the context of the Sudano-Sahelian biomes. We've looked at the context of we've looked at fragility issues in the context of small island development states, as well as the least developed countries, in addition to a very rich set of case studies that has accompanied on GEF's engagement in fragile and conflict-affected situations. So my colleague Malak has pointed you to and given you references to some of those. Tracy's alluded to a few references on what the bank is doing. And Carl's website on the Environmental Law Institute has a ton of information and on this. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much to our panelists, Tracy, Carl, Anupam. And with that, I'd like to close this session. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for a great discussion.